About 8 years ago, we were getting tired of new employees joining, and I would meet with all the new employees and go through this 100-page slide deck. And 2 out of 3 really got it and understood, and their managers had properly described to them Netflix. And 1 out of 3 were in shock because the deck has some aggressive statements like adequate performance gets a generous severance package, and we're a team, not a family. And so if you know that going in, you can love it. But if you don't know it and you didn't expect it, you feel bait and switched. And so the big driver was we realized every candidate should get it. And then, of course, if every candidate's going to get it, it's going to be public. So let's just make it public.
As you're doing scale to kind of keep a cultural norm as you scaled, was that one of the central tools for doing that?
Yes. I wouldn't quite say keep a cultural norm, but it was to share and debate. One of the great things about putting things in writing is that it makes it more debatable. And so it's not just hearing a sermon and it's like, okay, that's nice, but you can comment on, this part here that we wrote down doesn't really seem appropriate or doesn't seem what we do, or, to some degree, it's a bill of rights for employees, which is here's a set of things that we, the company, want to and aspire to operate by. And if we don't, you can call us on it, and then we'll either fix the articulation because it's too easy to misunderstand or live up to what we want to. So in some ways, it's aspirational. And then by putting it in writing, which probably started 5 years before that, it allows all the people in the company to collaborate on it and to suggest improvements.
What other things do you do to keep a healthy culture at scale? Like, what are the other kind of techniques in addition to the deck, addition to the onboarding?
Yeah, I would say in our first couple of years, so we're founded about 20 years ago in 97 to when we went public in 2002, all we were concerned with is not going bankrupt, because the first big internet recession was 2001, and so we had built up a big expense rate and contingent on future financing, and NASDAQ fell 75% that year, and all the venture capitals felt over-leveraged. They were barely going to be able to support their existing investments. Certainly, no one wanted to take on new ones. And so, while the year before, in 2000, to raise money was as easy as taking a tin can and shaking it. And, like $50 million would show up in the can. It was incredible. Never seen anything like it until last year. And then the following year, after the crash, you take your tin can out and shake it, and someone would steal the can. And so it was an enormously sharp and short change, which is why you see so much talk today about bubble, is the memory of, no one cares about the bubble, they care about the fall. So suddenly we didn't have enough money. We had to lay off a third of the company in 2001, and we eked into profitability and survived. But until that point, we really spent all the time just on how are we going to get the business to be we were DVD by mail at the time, so it's how is it going to be profitable? And only after 2002, we realized, wow, we're going to survive. That we started to think we should try to figure out what cultural attributes were there of what we wanted to work in. We didn't set out to try to say, like, what's the most theoretically efficient culture? What's the, and in some abstract sense, it was literally about us. And we realized that what we valued most, even more than success, was working with really talented people in a productive way. That joy of excellence was incredible. And of course, if you can get that joy of people excellence and talent density, then you're very likely to win. So, they come together. But at the core, it was about having dense talent. And part of it was, after we did this 1/3 layoff, it was 120 people to 80. We had expected to basically grind to a halt and really not be able to make any improvements, because it would take 80 people just to keep the lights on. But in fact, we got more done with only 80 people. We tried to figure out why, and we realized now there was no dummy proofing necessary. And so it was just everybody was going fast and everything was right. We realized with the right density of talent, there's very little process needed, and that was the joyful thing. So at first we said, well, let's do a 1/3 layoff every year. That was the key. And
That's a long-term winning strategy.
that's a long-term winning. It might be, back to the blitz scaling thing. So, and then we realized,
Blitz shrinking. We're going to now add
blitz
that.
shrinking. Well, you want your gross ads to be,
Yes.
100%,
Yes.
and your net ads are less. But talent density matters so much. So then we figured, no, let's not do a layoff every year like that. Let's just do continued focus. And the big evolution we came to is for managers, they have to each year testify for each of their people that if that person were trying to quit, they would try to change their mind. And so it's up to the manager to decide, yes, I would want to change their mind, but sometimes you find that you have people working for you, and if they quit, you'd be like, oh, that's pretty good. And that's the case we wanted to proactively, not wait for them to quit, but proactively give them a generous severance package.
Performance. What were the key things about establishing that culture which enabled you to scale? Because this is the highly aligned, loosely coupled part of your version 2 of the deck.
So I think when we went public, we were 150 people by then. People worried internally. Now that we're public, everything's going to, go to shit, because so many companies had done that, put in a lot of process, be very cautious, et cetera. And we've made great progress really every year of pushing back on that and doing something either symbolic or real that increased employee freedom. Essentially incented more variance in what we're doing. And we realized if we're going to run really loose, like very little rules, then you do want to set a broad context. So we set context, and this is what Reid's referring to, which is we added essentially a chapter to our slide deck, which is context, not control. And so we try to get managers to inspire and lead people rather than micromanage them. And they inspire and lead them through setting the context. What are we trying to do? What are the constraints? Is it a really big problem or a little problem? Must be done right, or are we do an approximate version and fix later? There's a lot of context to any problem area. And if you get good at setting context, then you don't have to direct the micro specifics. But it's an art. So there's context about the problem, and then there's context about behavior, which is really the culture, which is what are the behavioral norms in terms of honesty and sharing and forthrightness.
But people usually want to be able to do something like a bold new innovation usually requires somebody going, this is my idea, I'm driving it home. How does setting the context and that kind of innovation, how do those line up? And what do you do about that?
Well, I think you might be mixing with the manager shares a lot of context, but a lot of people make decisions. And so, and we definitely have decision owners. There's almost nothing by consensus, but you got to know the context, and then you make decisions, and a lot of things happen that I don't even know about different deals or different things or hiring. You guys are going to get lucky and meet with Marissa in a week or two. And one of the things that saddened me when she went to Yahoo, which was very brave of her to do, was this idea that she was going to review every resume, to raise the bar on hiring. And to me, that's a suicidal methodology for a senior executive, because you got 1,000 people and you're so tactically buried trying to, do 1,000 resumes. And I think what she was going for, and you can ask her, is a symbol of I care about the details. But a better way to do, there are better ways to do symbols. And so, I don't review resumes, I don't block hires. I look at it as my job is to evangelize the benefits of super great talent density. But we don't even try to hire perfectly, because when you are interviewing, it's 6 or 8 hours with someone. It's something, but you know them so much better after they've been in for 3 months. So I'm like, if you have an instinct you want to try, take the person in. If it doesn't work out, we'll give them a severance package and we'll move on. And it's not the end of the world. So we're experimental with people in the same way you might be experimental with a product feature or something. And it's important to be honest with a person when you're doing that. I mean, but we don't look at it as a marriage. Yeah. There's no need to, and that's essentially an adaptation to the growth.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think what Marissa is trying to do is a little bit, because we had Eric in here a couple weeks ago. Part of what Eric was expressing about how they built the Google culture was you can actually only hire people with certain kinds of degrees from certain kinds of universities where they were actually, in fact, reviewing every resume, every CV before. And I think she's like, okay, we got to get to that kind of setting in the bar. And that actually kind of leads naturally to kind of one of the questions.
That's like mistaken in so many ways. Yeah. First of all, it's trying to do it the Google way, which, anyways.
Well, that's precisely the question I was getting to, which is like there are other, attempts at building strong cultures. Google's one of them. How would you kind of compare and contrast so that people understand that like there isn't just Netflix is the only strong culture, but here is some way of understanding the variances between strong cultures?
Well, I think the key thing, and it's a great point, is there are many different cultures. And as long as you're really clear about your culture, you can get the employees who love that culture. And not everyone will be the same fit. There are some things like integrity that are pretty universal. But there are other things of how to deal with dissent where there's, perfectly reasonable different ways and effective different ways of dealing with things. And so, the literature on culture is pretty clear that strong cultures work and weak cultures are diffuse. So in a weak culture, it's really a diverse culture. You get many people acting very differently. And then they don't understand each other and they feel undercut and political. Even in let's take a Hollywood studio that many of you would not like to work in, they have a very clear system of how to operate in terms of how they manage the politics, and it's internally consistent. And everybody knows it, and the people who get good at it love it, and a lot of people don't. And that's just it's not inherently awful or ineffective. It just wasn't right, say, for us. And so that's why I think culture is an expression of what you and your senior team want to be. It's a bit aspirational in that way.
Is part of the interviewing process, do you have essentially a culture check? Like
yes, but not like a checklist. Mm-hmm. Culture is always something that we interview for, of kind of curiosity. And it's easy to find people who say, oh, I read the Netflix culture deck. I love it. I really want to be there. What's harder is, what are the main things you disagree with and why? Uh-huh. And when we get a blank stare, we're like, okay, not really a first principle thinker. And when they say, well, I thought the way that you didn't talk about how to acculturate, and if I'm not great on day 3, am I out? Or do you look at it like an athlete where it's over some time period to prove yourself? And if so, what's that time period, and why haven't you clarified that? Then we're like, oh yeah, that's a good insight. First principle thinker. So we're looking for people who, are curious, typically self-confident. And they're not, they're questioning everything around them.
Missions. So I think you can only have a strong culture when you actually have a mission in the company. How do you define the Netflix mission, and how is that kind of embodied in the strategy and in the work play?
I always believe that a strong mission statement's really important, and I have to say we've never succeeded at it. It's like this odd thing, we've had them every year for 15 years, and they're constantly different, and now we're also cynical. We're like, come on, we're trying to make people happy. I mean, that's the fundamental thing is in consumer service. We're trying to be better, and us in Disney and Mission aren't that different. There's a bunch of different tactics at it. But we're an emotional product. We cater to the things that are important but not necessary. And I love that part about it, because like when you're selling milk or penicillin, you're selling something somebody needs. And we get to sell something you want, okay, that you choose to do because it's really cool. It's human, to be entertained and to connect to people over entertainment. Because pure streaming works, and so we want to win as the best place to do pure streaming, not be the best place to do hybrid, because that wasn't a long-term benefit. So we had to not rely on DVD. So I think correctly we separated the two businesses.
How do you think about the first 5 to 10 people? How do you think about doing that hiring? How do you run it?
It's people you want to work with, but you can't be afraid to change. You can't let friendship get in the way of professional judgment. So you've always got to be thinking, do I have the right team? And I owe it to the whole team, to the marketplace, to my investors, to myself, to do what I think is the right thing for the company.
The compassion is not only to the individual, the compassion is to the company, the compassion is to the customers, the compassion is to shareholders. You actually have to integrate all of that compassion. Once you're doing that, that actually makes I understand this is painful for you, but actually, in fact, it's still a compassionate act. And that was actually one of the things I found really good in how.
Yeah, and I think one part of compassion is a severance package because, when you cut someone loose and, it's a week or two of pay, it really can be difficult for them. But our minimum is 4 months and it goes up from there. So even if like 2 weeks in, we realize, there's a mistake, as long as the person hasn't lied to us or something, but we've made a mistake, they get a 4-month severance package. And that does a couple things. One is, it makes the person feel better about it because they know that's, it's material amount of money. And again, 4 months is the minimum. And 2, we get a legal release in exchange for that. And so despite the fact that we've separated from 1,000 people maybe, we've never had an employee lawsuit because, of this. And then 3rd, and most subtly, managers are really nice people. They're human beings and they're good with people, so they don't like doing mean things. And so you can think of the severance payment as like a bribe to the manager to do the right thing because it makes it easier.
Yep.
And without that, what they do is they put an employee on a performance improvement plan, and then the 2 of them go through this excruciating dance, where that takes 2 or 3 or 4 months, and then they break up, but it's clearly documented. And that's just a lot worse. So that's why we avoid that and essentially buy out. And then the they'll take a month or 2 off and then they'll get snapped up somewhere.
Yep. When did you start with the 4-month severance package?
It was 3 months from the very beginning. So
that's unusual for a startup.
Yes, it's real money,
yes.
But it's worth it because again, otherwise the person, it's costing you anyway. It doesn't really cost you anymore.
Yes.
Okay, because you're going to spend the 3 months managing the person out.
Yes.
And so you're going to end up with that hit.
It's kind of the classic. Has your hiring changed as you scaled, like your hiring practices? And because you're very familiar with the whole blitzscaling pieces of how all these things change at each different magnitude. Was there anything notable when you look back at hiring that you said, oh, these are things we added in as we got to larger scales?
No, I would say we have a very big people judgment process. Some companies try to standardize and put a lot of statistics and analysis in, and we've never believed in that. We say about data, use a lot of data when you're picking stocks, but probably don't use a lot of data in picking a spouse. That the more that you're in an emotional element and a gut feel element, the less useful data is. And the more you want to really listen to your intuition and judgment. And so we spend a lot of time with candidates trying to get them to talk and feel, but then we don't do like how long did it take analysis or I don't know, something like that. And then we do a lot on references. There's this great tool, LinkedIn, and so you can find the reference. Like that has changed the game in references.
Role of the CEO. How do you define the role of the CEO?
That definitely varies by stage of company. In the first couple of years, you do everything. You're doing dishes at night. You're, coding maybe. You're writing marketing materials for sure. You're dealing with customers and investors. And, you have so many disadvantages as an irrelevant little nothing as a company. That you have to make up for it with talent and hard work and brute force. And so if you're lucky, that's only a couple of years as opposed to 10 years, where you're just on call constantly in a very intense way. And then the trick is, as you get to 50, 100 people, you've got to evolve your management style. As you get to 500 people, kind of each 10x, maybe even just 5x, you've got to adapt. To be more strategic. It used to be you knew every person and now you don't. So now you got to manage a little bit differently, and still you want to be, a great leader for those people. So when you get to real scale, most of what I do is vision about what markets we should be in. Like we should go global, we should do originals, but I'm not picking countries and I'm not picking shows. Vision of we should spend 5 or 10% of revenue on marketing as opposed to 50% or 2%. So some big macro decisions like that, but not what's the campaign. So there's vision there. There's vision in terms of culture. What are the rules of the road of how the firm operates? What's our character so that it's a healthy place?
Key characteristics to know in advance in order to scale. And then, what's your kind of reflections on the kind of the different levels?
Well, let's see. There are scale economies in businesses like Amazon and Netflix. The bigger you get, the cheaper the marginal customer sale is. And those are powerful. Those merit you investing forward to get to scale, and so running losses for the first couple of years, doing things like that. So call that normal business. And then there's a couple of rare businesses like LinkedIn, Facebook, that are network effect businesses. And then the prize of getting big first is so much larger than just a scale business, that in those businesses, it's worth, selling 90% of the company to raise $1 billion to be the big one. You must be the winner. It's such extreme winner take all. And so I think it's the degree of winner take all and network effect that gets you to either take the risks and the stress of blitz scaling rather than the more like Netflix, like Amazon, in the early years were growing 80% year over year, and then 70 and 60, now we're 25, and 25 at our size or Amazon's are big numbers. Okay, but that's like a normal, great scaling business. And both Amazon against Walmart and us against cable and satellite, we have huge markets. Okay, so growing at these rates is great, and hopefully we'll be able to grow for 20 years, and Amazon the same. But then there's a couple businesses, again, eBay was one of the first, where it's real network effect. And in those businesses, I think you do kind of crazy practices because you've got to grow 300% to maximize the opportunity. So you're going to be sloppy on a number of things. So you probably don't worry about talent density, and you don't do a bunch of the things that I described, which are the things that are appropriate if you're trying to be a careful, disciplined operator. But if it's, get big or go home, and, then that's the interesting thing. But again, most businesses is not that.
Some of the things that I think interesting about it is sometimes it's network effects. Sometimes you have to get to a minimum scale, which is Amazon and you, and other, there's a number of other businesses. The thing I think is, would be fun to get some perspective on here for you is like, when do you think that it's necessary to move fast because of competition, right? So like, for example, another thing I think drives scaling fast is you say, okay, I've got to occupy the greenfield market before them. Because presumably this is a little bit of how you're thinking about global now. Like in terms of, it's not just a question of content and globalism, but it's a question of, look, we've proven this thing, and let's in every relevant market in the world, this is something we should be there. Is it no?
No, or yes and no. A company can get started 2 or 3 years before us in Germany, and we can knock them out in 12 months. So because we have great scale, and it's not a network effect. Where when eBay tried to knock out Yahoo Japan, they didn't succeed, and that's been permanent. And so if you're in a network effect business, then you get more of first is forever. Okay, because the barriers are really strong. But if you're just in a scale business, you can go in with a lot of content and energy, depending on what your market is, and that's why Amazon. It's like how quickly did they wipe out CD Now? In like 1999, like really quickly, right? Because it didn't matter that CD Now had started earlier or something like, or had more scale on that side. So again, I think it's really related to barriers, and these network effect barriers are so strong.
Although, just as you're saying, scale barriers are relevant too, because once you get to a certain size, you can leverage your size in order to win, because that's precisely your Germany point.
There are scale economies. They're just not as strong as a barrier. So you can think of barrier as how much pricing power do you have, which could either be how much advertising or what the literal price is. And if you've got a ton of pricing power, then you can raise prices a lot, and it's still very hard to come after you because you've got that network. So the question is, how do we evolve the internal management to move from DVD to streaming? Because the first streaming product offering was integrated into DVD. If you were a DVD subscriber from Netflix, you then got a little bit of free streaming, and then you got a little more free streaming. It was pretty integrated, as opposed to it was a separate offering. So it only got really difficult when we got to a separate offering. There's a streaming service from Netflix, and there's a DVD service. And the only really painful part was probably 2010 or 2011 Out of 30 VPs, we had 5 who focused on DVD. And this was a close-knit exec team. And then we kicked the 5 out of the meeting. And we realized we have to eat, sleep, and breathe streaming like Hulu, and not also have this great 5 people. And of course, they felt bad. And eventually they realized they're great at DVDs and they should follow that. So there was a time of separation. But in the first part, it was integrated, but that's because the product offering was integrated. Well, as you grow,
Repeat the question.
Yes, thanks. The question is, how have regulatory strategies been important? We've had to fight for net neutrality, and a big threat for us was that cable companies, who are most of broadband, would get to charge us a tremendous amount to be able to serve our customers, as opposed to be pretty open, and that they would have an advantage because they wouldn't charge themselves. So we've had to fight that regulatory battle over the last 4 years. And then every company that gets large faces antitrust concerns over time. And you see that with Google in Europe right now. Sure, the classic, well, it's probably not for you guys, but it used to be a classic metaphor for companies was the family, and you'd hire them and you'd be like, we're a family, we look after each other. And it's kind of baloney because, you'll lay someone off in a way that you wouldn't, your sister. And so, it's like you want them to work for you like they were a family member for free and cheap, but you're not really prepared to treat them like a family member, if you're honest. And so really the professional relationship is like a sports team. And if you want to win a championship, you got to have incredible talent at every position. And so we say, look, we're like a professional sport, not like your kid's soccer team, but no, like a professional sports team where we pay people well, we want them to win. And if you have one bad game, you don't lose your position. But ultimately, you're fighting for your position every year. And that's how we feel about it. And it's, as long as we're honest about it, it's exciting because then you can play really sophisticated sports. So to do a blind pass in soccer and you just know the person's there, that's an art. You need great teammates, that you are so well rehearsed. And, so to do that, you need great talent, and that's fun to be around.